The ship Mercy Dawn rocked gently on the blue waves as Staff Sergeant Daniel Ruiz stepped on board with his duffel bag hanging from one shoulder. The sun was sharp that morning, cutting across the steel decks and making everything shine. Around him, sailors moved quickly, some laughing, some shouting orders. A mix of noise and motion that made him feel like he was stepping into another world. Daniel was not new to the military, but this ship felt different. It wasn't like the desert bases he had known, where dust covered everything and the sound of helicopters never stopped. Here, the smell of salt water mixed with metal. The air was heavy and damp, and the faces were unfamiliar. He was the new combat medic assigned to the crew, and people always noticed the new guy. When he walked through the narrow hallways, people turned to look. He wasn't tall or broad like most of the soldiers. His shoulders were lean, his movements calm and careful. His uniform was clean but plain, no flashy badges, no loud confidence. To most of the men on board, he looked like someone who had spent his career behind a desk or in a safe zone. The first few days were awkward. Daniel stayed quiet, doing his work and learning the layout of the ship's medical bay. The others talked loudly around him. Stories about bar fights, near-death missions, and medals. When they noticed Daniel listening quietly, they took it as a sign of weakness. One of them, a big Marine named Carter, laughed and said, "Hey Doc, hope you brought extra band-aids. You might see a paper cut out here." The group laughed. Daniel just smiled politely and went back to checking his supplies. He didn't try to defend himself. There was no point. He had met men like this before. Full of pride, loud in groups, but often softer when it truly mattered. Daniel had learned that real strength didn't need to shout. Still, the jokes kept coming. At lunch, in the mess hall, a few of the soldiers made a game of it. "Hey medic, you ever even seen real blood?" Bet he fainted the first time he held a needle. Sometimes it stung, but Daniel didn't show it. He just kept to himself, eating quietly and leaving before anyone could start again. What they didn't know, what none of them could guess, was that Daniel Ruiz had seen more blood and pain than most of them ever would. He had served 3 tours as a field medic in Afghanistan, patching up soldiers under fire, carrying wounded men out of burning vehicles, and once nearly losing his own life when a convoy was ambushed. But he never talked about it. He carried those memories deep inside, along with the scars that marked his ribs, a reminder of a night when he refused to leave a dying man behind. Those scars weren't just lines on his skin. They were chapters of a story no one had asked to hear. Daniel's bunk was small and cramped, but he didn't mind. He spent his free time cleaning his gear, checking his medical kit again and again, making sure every bandage, every needle, every vial was ready. He had learned that preparation saved lives. One evening, when the ship was quiet, he stood alone on the deck, watching the horizon fade into gold. The wind carried the sound of waves and the distant hum of the engine. For a moment, he let himself breathe, slow, steady, peaceful. Out here, no gunfire, no sandstorms, no sudden explosions. Just the ocean and the endless sky. He thought about the faces of the men he had saved, and the ones he hadn't. He remembered their voices, the weight of their hands as he carried them. The world saw him as a medic, but to him every mission had been a promise that no one would die alone if he could help it. On the ship, though, he was just the new guy, the one they laughed at, and maybe he thought that was fine. Let them laugh. He wasn't there for praise. He was there to help when the time came, because sooner or later it always did. Over the next week, the mocking quieted down a little. Some soldiers began to notice how steady his hands were, how calm his voice sounded when he worked. One night during a drill, a young crewman cut his hand badly, and Daniel treated it quickly, no hesitation, no fuss. He spoke softly to the man, keeping him calm, wrapping the wound with clean precision. The others watched silently. For a brief second, the jokes stopped. But by the next morning, the teasing started again. Smaller now, less confident, but still there. Daniel didn't react. He had learned long ago that the best answer to doubt was action. Words meant little, results meant everything. So he kept going, quiet, steady, invisible, waiting, watching, knowing that when real danger came, laughter would fade, and they'd see who truly stood beside them. He didn't want respect. He wanted readiness. Because deep down, Daniel Ruiz knew what the others didn't. That war had a way of showing a man's truth. And when that moment came, he would be ready, even if no one else believed it yet. Daniel Ruiz had a quiet way of moving through life, but behind that calm face was a history no one on the ship knew. When people looked at him, they saw just another medic, calm, polite, and ordinary. But if they had seen what he had seen, they would never have laughed. Years before, Daniel had served in Afghanistan. He had been a young medic then, only 24, still learning how to handle fear. The first time he saw real combat, the world around him changed forever. The air was filled with the sound of gunfire, the smell of smoke, and the cries of men calling for help. In that chaos, Daniel's hands had to stay steady. One mistake could mean a man's life. At first, fear almost froze him. The noise, the shouting, the blood. It was too much. But then he saw a soldier lying on the ground, clutching his stomach, gasping for air. No one else was close enough to help. That moment changed him. Something deep inside Daniel woke up. A voice that said, "Move, now." He crawled through the dirt, bullets flying overhead, and pressed his hands on the soldier's wound. The man's blood soaked through his uniform, but Daniel didn't stop. He worked fast, whispering, "You're gonna be okay. Stay with me." That soldier survived. From that day, Daniel knew what his purpose was. Over the next few years, Daniel became known for keeping calm even in the worst situations. While others shouted or panicked, he stayed quiet, thinking only about saving the next life. He saw friends die, missions fail, and entire teams break apart, but he kept doing his job. The medals he earned never mattered much to him. What mattered were the men who went home alive because he refused to give up. But there was one night Daniel never forgot. The night that left the scars on his ribs. It was his third tour, in a remote valley surrounded by mountains. His unit was returning from a supply mission when their convoy hit an IED, an explosive hidden under the dirt road. The blast threw their vehicle into the air. Metal twisted, glass shattered, and fire spread fast. Daniel woke up half buried under debris, his chest burning and ears ringing. The world was spinning, but through the smoke, he could hear screaming. He pulled himself free, his side bleeding badly. He could barely breathe, but there was no time to think about pain. Two of his men were trapped in the burning vehicle, shouting for help. Daniel ran toward the fire. The heat was unbearable, but he climbed onto the wreckage, ignoring the flames licking at his uniform. He managed to pull one man out, then went back for the second. That was when another explosion went off, smaller but close enough to tear open his side. The pain was so sharp he thought it would kill him, but he still dragged the soldier out before collapsing. When the medevac finally arrived, Daniel was barely conscious. Later, in the field hospital, the doctors told him he was lucky to be alive. The shrapnel had cut deep near his ribs, and the scars would stay forever. But Daniel didn't think of them as marks of pain. He thought of them as proof that he did his duty. Those scars reminded him that courage wasn't about being fearless. It was about moving forward even when fear tried to stop you. When he finally returned home, Daniel didn't tell his family much about what happened. He just said, "It was tough, but we made it." He didn't want to relive those memories or make others feel sorry for him. He healed quietly both inside and out. But the nightmares stayed. Sometimes he'd wake up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, hearing phantom gunfire in his mind. Then he'd sit up, touch the old scars on his ribs, and remind himself, they lived. That's what matters. Years later, when he joined the crew of Mercy Dawn, Daniel thought maybe he could leave those memories behind. The ocean was peaceful, steady, the opposite of war. But even there, among the waves, he carried those scars like a hidden truth under his uniform. Every time someone laughed at him or called him soft, he wanted to tell them what he had been through. How many men he had carried through gunfire, how many nights he had spent stitching wounds under moonlight. But he didn't. Words could never truly explain it. Sometimes, when he was alone in the medical bay, he would lift his shirt and look at the thin, uneven scars across his ribs. They were pale now, but they still ached in the cold. He would trace them with his fingers and remember the faces of the men he saved that night. He wondered where they were now, if they ever thought about him. Probably not, he told himself with a soft smile. That was fine. Saving them had been enough. Out on the ship, life was quiet, but Daniel stayed alert. He knew how fast peace could disappear. 1 second everything could be calm, the next chaos. He had learned never to underestimate how quickly life could change. So while others joked and relaxed, Daniel made sure his medical gear was always ready. His hands always steady, his mind always sharp. No one on the ship knew the truth about him. They didn't know that beneath that calm smile and simple uniform was a man who had already faced death and won. Not once, but many times. They didn't know that the reason he stayed quiet wasn't fear. It was respect. Respect for the lives he'd seen lost, and the ones he'd managed to save. And though they couldn't see it, Daniel carried something stronger than medals or rank. The kind of quiet strength that only comes from surviving hell and still choosing to heal others. Days turned into weeks on the ship Mercy Dawn, and Daniel Ruiz slowly became a familiar face among the crew. But being familiar didn't mean being respected. The soldiers still saw him as quiet, too soft, too gentle to be one of them. In their world, loudness meant confidence, and silence looked like weakness. Daniel did his work carefully every day, cleaning instruments, checking medical kits, and helping with small injuries or illnesses among the crew. He was always polite, always calm. But calmness can be mistaken for fear, and soon, some of the men began to take his silence as permission to mock him. It started with small jokes. When Daniel walked past, someone would whisper, "Careful, the medic might faint if he sees blood." Others laughed. Sometimes, they would toss a roll of bandages at his table during lunch and say, "Better keep these ready for yourself, Doc." He would just smile softly, pick them up, and continue eating. He didn't answer back, not even once. But what the men didn't understand was that Daniel had faced things far worse than their words. He had looked death in the eyes before. He had heard the sound of men begging him to save them when hope was gone. These jokes, these small insults, they meant nothing compared to what he had already survived. Still, being human, the words stung a little. It wasn't the insult itself, but the unfairness of it. They judged him without knowing who he truly was. There was one man in particular who loved to make fun of Daniel, Corporal Blake. He was tall, loud, and proud of his combat record. He believed that respect was earned through muscle and medals. To him, Daniel was just a desk medic. Someone who knew how to clean a cut, but not how to survive a battlefield. One night in the mess hall, Blake decided to embarrass Daniel in front of everyone. "Hey, Ruiz," he called out, his voice loud over the noise of the room. "Tell us something. You ever been in a real fight, or just in those hospital dramas you watch?" A few people laughed. Daniel looked up from his food, met Blake's eyes, and replied quietly, "I've seen enough fights, Corporal." "Oh yeah." Blake grinned. "Like what? Someone break a nail in your clinic?" The table roared with laughter. Daniel smiled faintly, finished his meal, and stood up. "You'll find out someday," he said simply, and walked away. The room went silent for a moment after he left. There was something about his tone, calm, but firm, that made even Blake stop smiling for a second. Still, he shrugged it off and the laughter started again. But a few men at the table began to wonder. Later that night, Daniel sat alone in the ship's medical bay, cleaning instruments that were already spotless. He didn't mind being alone. In fact, he preferred it. The steady hum of the ship's engines reminded him of his heartbeat, calm, strong, constant. He thought about what Blake had said, and though it didn't make him angry, it made him sad. Not for himself, but for the men who believed that bravery only came with noise. They didn't understand that courage could be quiet, too. Steady hands, calm eyes, and a heart that never gives up even when terrified. The next morning, training drills began early. The crew was practicing for emergency responses, fire drills, man overboard situations, medical emergencies. Daniel's job was to assist in the mock medical rescue. During one drill, a crewman pretended to be injured. The others had to bring him in, while Daniel treated the wound. It was supposed to be a simple exercise, but Daniel took it seriously. He worked fast, talking the patient through the procedure as if it were real. When the drill ended, the officer in charge said, "That's how it's done, Ruiz. Quick and professional." Some of the crew who had been laughing at him earlier looked at each other, surprised. One of them muttered, "He's good," but Blake just rolled his eyes. "It's fake blood," he said. "Let's see how calm he stays when it's real." That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. He went up to the deck and leaned against the railing, staring at the stars. The ocean stretched endlessly around him, dark and quiet. The wind brushed his face, and he closed his eyes for a moment. He thought about his old team, the ones who never made it home. He could still remember each face, each voice. He remembered the night he got his scars, how he kept moving even when his body was screaming for him to stop. He whispered softly to the sea, "I didn't save everyone, but I tried." Down below deck, laughter and music echoed faintly from the recreation room. He could hear Blake's voice again, loud and full of confidence. But Daniel stayed where he was, letting the cool air wash away the noise. He knew something the others didn't. Life had a way of testing every man. The day always came when the jokes stopped, when laughter turned to fear, and when only calm, trained hands could make the difference between life and death. Daniel didn't wish for that day to come, but he knew it would. Ships, war zones, bases, it was always the same story. One day something would go wrong, and when it did, people would finally see who truly stood their ground. So he waited, patient as ever. He didn't need to prove himself with words or anger. He would prove it when the moment came. And when it did, no one on that ship would ever forget who Daniel Ruiz really was. It was just after dawn when the alarm went off. The ship Mercy Dawn shook slightly as the sound of the emergency siren echoed through the halls. The sharp voice of the captain came through the intercom. "All crew report to stations. We've got a distress signal. Down transport helicopter near the eastern coast. Multiple wounded. Possible hostile area." The calm morning turned into instant chaos. Soldiers grabbed their gear, medics prepared stretchers, and orders flew from every direction. The crew knew what that signal meant, a rescue mission in dangerous territory. Daniel Ruiz was already up, double-checking his medical kit before anyone even called his name. His hands moved quickly, practiced from years of doing this. Extra bandages, syringes, blood packs, field dressings, everything had to be perfect. Mistakes in the field could cost lives. When the lieutenant entered the medical bay, he looked surprised to see Daniel already ready. "Ruiz, you're on standby. We're sending a team of 6. High-risk zone." Daniel straightened his shoulders. "I want in, sir." The lieutenant raised an eyebrow. "You sure? It's not exactly your usual post. You'll be out in the open." Daniel nodded. "That's where I'm needed." A few soldiers nearby overheard the conversation. One of them whispered, "The medic wants to play hero now." Another chuckled, "Hope he doesn't cry when he sees real blood." Daniel heard them but didn't react. He just secured his gear, his face calm as always. Within minutes, the rescue team boarded a small landing craft that would take them to the coast. The sea was rough that morning, waves crashing against the sides. The wind howled, spraying cold water across their faces. Daniel sat quietly near the back, checking his gloves and supplies again. The other soldiers talked nervously, trying to hide their fear with jokes. Blake, the loud corporal, was among them, still smirking. When he looked at Daniel, he said, "If things go bad out there, don't expect me to carry you, Doc." Daniel glanced at him and replied softly, "Let's just make sure everyone gets back." Something in his voice, calm, steady, serious, made Blake look away. As they neared the shore, smoke could be seen in the distance. The helicopter had gone down in a rocky area near a line of cliffs. Black smoke twisted into the sky, and flashes of small fire could still be seen. The team's radios crackled with static and half-broken words, signs of gunfire nearby. When they landed, the scene was worse than anyone expected. The chopper was torn apart, pieces scattered across the sand and rocks. The air smelled of burning fuel and blood. 2 soldiers were already dead. 3 others were alive but badly hurt. One with a broken leg, another with shrapnel in his chest, and one lying unconscious, barely breathing. The lieutenant shouted orders, and the soldiers formed a perimeter, guns ready. Daniel dropped to his knees beside the wounded without hesitation. His world narrowed to one thing: save whoever could still be saved. He started with the soldier who wasn't breathing properly. Collapsed lung, he muttered to himself. His hands moved fast, cutting through the uniform, sealing the wound, inserting a small chest valve from his kit. The man gasped, coughing, and Daniel whispered, "That's it. Stay with me." Bullets suddenly hit the rocks nearby, sharp cracks echoing across the cliffs. The enemy was still in the area. The soldiers fired back, yelling for cover. But Daniel didn't move. He stayed crouched over his patient, pressing his hands against the wound to keep him alive. Blake shouted, "Ruiz, get down." But Daniel didn't even look up. "If I stop now, he dies," he shouted back. His voice wasn't loud, but it was full of force, the kind that made others listen. The team fought back, pushing the attackers away long enough for Daniel to stabilize all 3 survivors. Then, while helping lift one man onto the stretcher, Daniel suddenly felt a sharp pain in his side. A piece of shrapnel had cut through his vest, reopening the old scars across his ribs. The pain was blinding, but he gritted his teeth and kept moving. Blake noticed the blood on Daniel's uniform. "You're hit," he yelled. "I'm fine," Daniel said through clenched teeth. "Keep moving." He refused to stop. Every time someone stumbled, Daniel helped them up. Every time someone screamed, he shouted directions. "Apply pressure there. Keep his airway open. Don't let him go unconscious." He moved like a man who had done this 100 times before, because he had. By the time the backup team arrived and the area was secure, Daniel was pale and trembling, but still treating the wounded. When the lieutenant finally ordered him to sit, Daniel obeyed, sinking to the ground beside the stretcher. His side was soaked with blood, his shirt sticking to his skin. He pressed a cloth against it and smiled faintly when he saw the men he had saved still breathing. Blake knelt beside him, eyes wide. "You should have been dead," he said quietly. Daniel looked at him, still calm, still steady. "Medics don't die before their patients," he said, half joking, half serious. For the first time since Daniel had joined the ship, Blake had nothing to say. He looked at the man he had once mocked and saw someone completely different. Someone who didn't need to talk big or act tough. Daniel Ruiz had just proven everything without saying a word. As the helicopter arrived to take them all back to Mercy Dawn, Daniel leaned back against a rock, the pain still sharp in his ribs. But inside he felt a strange peace. This was why he was there. Not for medals or applause, but to keep people alive when everything else was falling apart. And though he didn't know it yet, what happened that day would soon reach the Admiral's ears and change everything for Daniel Ruiz. Smoke filled the air like a heavy curtain, turning everything gray. The smell of burning metal, gunpowder, and blood mixed into something unforgettable. The ground shook with every explosion in the distance. This was not a rescue anymore, it was survival. Daniel Ruiz crouched beside a fallen Marine, his hands working fast while bullets cracked against the rocks around him. His medical gloves were torn, his uniform soaked with sweat and blood. Some his own, most not. The man beneath him was pale, bleeding badly from a leg wound. Daniel wrapped the bandage tight and shouted to the nearest soldier, "Apply pressure and don't let go." The soldier nodded, terrified but listening. Daniel moved to the next injured man. Another explosion went off nearby, showering them with dirt and shrapnel. He didn't even flinch. He had been in worse. His focus never broke. All around him was chaos. The rescue team was pinned down behind broken pieces of the crashed helicopter. The enemy fire came from the ridge above, flashes of light and sharp cracks echoing through the valley. The lieutenant was shouting orders, but his voice was nearly drowned out by the noise. "Medic, we need you here," someone yelled. Daniel ran toward the voice, his boots slipping on the dirt. He found a young Marine, barely 20, with a deep wound in his chest. The boy was gasping for air, his eyes wide with fear. Daniel knelt beside him, speaking softly, "You're okay. Just look at me. Keep breathing." His tone was steady, almost peaceful, even though danger was everywhere. He tore open his medical bag, pulled out a chest seal, and pressed it over the wound. The boy winced, but Daniel's calm voice kept him still. "Good, that's it. You're doing great." Suddenly, a sharp pain hit Daniel's side, like fire slicing through his ribs. A small piece of metal had hit him during the last blast. He felt the warmth of blood spreading under his vest. For a second, his vision blurred, and the memory of that night in Afghanistan flashed before him. The fire, the screams, the same burning pain in his ribs. But he shook his head, refusing to stop. He pressed a hand over his wound, then tied a field dressing around it, tight enough to keep going. Pain was nothing new to him. The mission mattered more. Blake saw him stumble and shouted, "Ruiz, you're bleeding." Daniel looked up, his face pale but focused. "So are they," he said simply, and went back to work. That single line silenced everyone around him. Even in the middle of chaos, Daniel's calmness gave others courage. He crawled through smoke to reach another wounded man trapped under a piece of wreckage. The soldier was screaming, his leg pinned. Daniel called for help, and together with two others, he lifted the metal just enough to drag the man free. His hands were shaking from exhaustion, his side burning, but he didn't stop. "Stay with me," Daniel whispered, checking the soldier's pulse. He injected morphine to ease the pain and quickly wrapped the wound. He knew they didn't have much time. The evacuation chopper was still 15 minutes away, 15 long, dangerous minutes. The enemy fire slowed for a moment, and in that small window, Daniel went from one patient to another, checking vitals, tightening bandages, keeping people awake. His mind worked like a machine. Every second counted, every breath mattered. Then the worst happened. One of the injured stopped breathing. A Marine shouted, "He's gone!" But Daniel didn't accept that. "No one dies today," he said firmly. He started CPR right there on the ground, his own blood dripping down his side. He pressed on the soldier's chest again and again, his voice steady. "Come on, breathe, come on." After what felt like forever, the man coughed and gasped for air. Daniel smiled weakly and said, "Good job. Don't you dare quit on me now." Blake watched all of this with wide eyes. The man he used to mock, the quiet medic he thought was weak, was now leading the fight for life itself. Daniel was covered in blood, half bleeding to death himself, but still moving, still fighting for others. When the evacuation chopper finally arrived, the wind from its blades kicked up sand and smoke everywhere. The soldiers helped lift the wounded aboard, one by one. Daniel refused to get on until everyone else was safe. "Ruiz, that's an order," the lieutenant shouted. "You're hurt." Daniel shook his head. "I'll get on last." He helped load the final stretcher, then finally allowed Blake to pull him toward the ramp. As they lifted off, Daniel's body went weak, the adrenaline fading. He slumped against the wall of the chopper, still holding his medical bag. Blake looked at him, his voice low. "You saved all of them. You saved us." Daniel gave a tired smile. "That's the job." Then his eyes closed, and he passed out. Back at the Mercy Dawn, the medics rushed him to the infirmary. They stitched up his side and treated the reopened scars. The doctor in charge shook his head in disbelief. "You're lucky, Sergeant Ruiz. Another inch, and that shrapnel would have hit your lung." When Daniel woke up hours later, the room was quiet. The first face he saw was Blake, sitting nearby. The same man who had laughed at him for weeks now sat with his head down, unable to meet his eyes. Blake finally said softly, "I was wrong about you." Daniel smiled faintly. "You just didn't know me yet." Outside the medical bay, word of what Daniel had done spread quickly through the ship. The quiet medic who everyone once mocked was now the man who had saved an entire team under fire. And though Daniel didn't care for attention, something deep inside him felt lighter. He hadn't just saved lives, he had shown them what real courage looked like. He leaned back on his bed, wincing from the pain, but there was peace in his eyes. He didn't need medals or speeches. The sight of those soldiers alive was enough. What he didn't know was that his story had already reached the Admiral's desk, and soon that man would come to see him in person. The rescue was over, but the memory of it stayed with everyone on the ship Mercy Dawn. The air on board felt different when they returned. The laughter, the usual noise. It was all quieter now. People spoke in softer tones, their eyes filled with respect. They all knew what had happened out there. When the medevac helicopter landed on the deck, the crew rushed to help the wounded. Daniel Ruiz was the last one carried out, lying on a stretcher, his uniform soaked with blood. The same men who once laughed at him now stood silently as the medics lifted him off the helicopter. No one made jokes. No one said a word. Blake followed close behind, helping to carry one of the stretchers. His face was pale, still covered in dirt from the battlefield. He looked at Daniel and whispered, "Hang in there, Doc." Daniel tried to smile but was too weak to speak. His eyes closed as they wheeled him away. In the medical bay, the doctors worked quickly. They cleaned his wounds, removed the shrapnel, and stitched the deep cut along his ribs. Daniel drifted in and out of sleep, hearing only fragments of voices. He lost a lot of blood. Stabilize his breathing. He's strong. He'll make it. Hours passed before he finally opened his eyes. The ceiling above him was white and blurry. His body felt heavy, every movement painful. For a moment, he didn't remember where he was. Then it came back. The smoke, the shouting, the blood, the lives he had saved. He turned his head slowly and saw Blake sitting in a chair nearby, still wearing his torn combat gear. The tough soldier who used to laugh at him now looked completely different. Quiet, serious, almost guilty. When he noticed Daniel was awake, Blake stood up quickly. "You're alive," he said softly, relief clear in his voice. "Still here," Daniel whispered, his voice rough but calm. Blake looked at him for a long moment, then said, "I don't know how to thank you. You saved us all out there." Daniel gave a weak smile. "That's what medics do." For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. Then Blake said quietly, "I was wrong about you. I thought you were weak. But you're the bravest man I've ever met." Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, breathing slowly. "Courage isn't about fighting," he said. "It's about not giving up when others need you." Later that day, word spread across the ship about Daniel's actions. The story traveled fast. How he worked under fire, how he saved every man, how he refused to leave until the last soldier was safe. The crew who once joked behind his back now looked at him with admiration. Even the lieutenant who had doubted his request to join the mission came to see him. "You did more out there than anyone could have expected," the lieutenant said. "You saved lives, Ruiz. I'll make sure the Admiral hears about it." Daniel just nodded. "I was only doing my job, sir." The officer smiled. "Maybe, but not everyone would have done it the way you did." Over the next few days, Daniel remained in the infirmary, slowly recovering. The doctors told him to rest, but he couldn't help checking on the other wounded soldiers. Even while lying in bed, he guided the younger medics, giving them quiet instructions. "Make sure his 4 doesn't block," he'd say, or, "Keep the wound clean and dry." One morning, Blake and a few others from the mission came to visit. They brought a small gift, a patch from their unit torn and dirty from the battlefield. Blake placed it gently on Daniel's table. "You earned this more than any of us," he said. Daniel looked at the patch and smiled. "We earned it together." Blake shook his head. "You don't get it, do you? You kept us alive. You didn't just patch wounds, you gave us hope out there. When we saw you working, bleeding, and not giving up, we couldn't give up either." Daniel didn't know what to say. He just looked down, quietly touched by the words. For a man who had always preferred silence, this moment said more than any medal ever could. As the days went by, the bruises on his body began to fade, but the pain in his ribs remained. A reminder of both the past and what he had just survived. Sometimes at night, he'd wake up from a dream where he was back on that battlefield, hearing the sounds of gunfire again. But now, when he looked down at his scars, he didn't see pain. He saw strength. The other medics started to treat him differently too. They asked him questions, eager to learn from him. Some called him Sir, even though he wasn't an officer. Daniel always laughed softly and told them, "Just call me Ruiz." One evening, when the sun was setting over the ocean, Daniel managed to walk out onto the deck. The sky was orange and pink, the waves calm. He leaned on the railing, breathing in the fresh air. It felt peaceful, almost unreal after everything that had happened. He thought about the soldiers he saved, their faces, their families waiting somewhere far away. He thought about the ones he couldn't save years ago, and how maybe, in some way, saving these men had brought him a small piece of peace. Behind him, footsteps approached. It was Blake again. He stood beside Daniel for a moment before speaking. "You know, everyone on this ship talks about what you did. Even the captain said he's never seen anything like it." Daniel smiled at the ocean. "I didn't do it for them to talk about it." "I know," Blake said quietly. "That's why it means more." They stood there in silence for a long time, watching the sun disappear into the sea. The wind was soft, the ship steady, and for the first time since arriving on Mercy Dawn, Daniel felt truly seen. Not as a weak medic, not as the quiet new guy, but as a soldier who had earned respect through action, not words. The laughter that once followed him had vanished, replaced by salutes and quiet nods of respect whenever he walked by. But Daniel didn't seek attention. He simply went back to his duties as soon as he could. To him, the mission was never about glory, it was always about saving lives. What he didn't know was that far above his rank, his name had reached someone powerful, the Admiral himself, and the next chapter of his life was about to change forever. The day began like any other on the ship Mercy Dawn. The crew went about their duties. The sea stretched endlessly around them, and the sound of engines hummed softly beneath their feet. But there was a strange kind of energy in the air that morning. Quiet whispers, quick footsteps, and faces filled with nervous excitement. Word had spread fast. The Admiral himself was coming aboard. No one knew exactly why. Admirals didn't usually visit a medical ship unless something truly important had happened. But the rumors all pointed to one name, Sergeant Daniel Ruiz. Daniel didn't think much of it at first. He was sitting in the infirmary, helping a young medic sort through supplies. He was still recovering, though the stitches on his ribs itched every time he moved. He had no idea that the highest-ranking officer in the fleet was on his way to meet him. Outside, sailors stood at attention along the deck as the Admiral's helicopter approached. The wind from the blades whipped across the deck, scattering loose papers and rattling the railings. When the aircraft finally landed, the ship's captain and several officers stepped forward to greet the visitor. Admiral Jonathan Hale stepped out of the chopper, tall, sharp-eyed, with the calm confidence of a man who had seen many wars. He saluted the captain and got straight to the point. "I'm here to meet the medic," he said. "The one from the Ridge Rescue." The captain nodded quickly. "Yes, sir. Sergeant Daniel Ruiz. He's in the infirmary, recovering." "Good," the Admiral said. "Take me to him." Inside the medical bay, Daniel was adjusting a bandage on a soldier's arm when he noticed the sudden silence. The younger medic stood straight, eyes wide. Then the door opened, and the Admiral entered with two officers behind him. Everyone snapped to attention, except Daniel, who was still kneeling beside his patient. He looked up, confused, not realizing who had just walked in. "At ease," the Admiral said, his voice firm but kind. He walked forward, his boots clicking softly on the metal floor. His eyes settled on Daniel. "You must be Sergeant Ruiz." Daniel slowly stood up, straightening his uniform as best he could. "Yes, sir," he replied quietly. The Admiral studied him for a moment. There was something about Daniel, his calm eyes, his modest stance, that didn't match the stories he had heard. He looked nothing like a hero, and yet those who had been there told a different story. "I've read the reports," the Admiral said. "You saved 8 men under direct fire. You refused evacuation. You continued to treat others even after you were wounded. Is that true?" Daniel shifted uncomfortably. "I did what I had to, sir. They needed me." The Admiral raised an eyebrow. "That's all." Daniel nodded. "Yes, sir. It was my job." The Admiral's lips curved into a small smile. "If every man did his job the way you did, Sergeant, we'd have no losses in war. There was a moment of silence. Everyone in the room was watching, barely breathing. The Admiral took a slow step closer to Daniel. "I've served for 30 years, he said quietly. "I've seen bravery in many forms. Men who charged into battle, men who refused to retreat. But what you did out there," he paused, his voice lowering, "that's the kind of courage that keeps this fleet alive." Daniel didn't know how to respond. Compliments made him uncomfortable. He wasn't used to being noticed, let alone praised by someone so high in rank. "Sir," he said softly, "I didn't do it alone. My team." The Admiral raised a hand. "I know. But they all say the same thing, that without you, none of them would have made it back." Then, something unexpected happened. The Admiral took a deep breath, stepped forward, and gave Daniel a sharp, respectful salute. For a moment Daniel froze. He had never been saluted by an admiral before, certainly not one of Hale's rank. Around the room, everyone stood silent, their eyes wide. "You may not wear the medals yet," the admiral said, "but you've already earned them." Daniel hesitated, then slowly returned the salute. His hands trembled slightly, not from pain this time, but from the weight of the moment. The admiral's gesture meant more than any award. It was respect, real, earned respect. After a few seconds, the admiral lowered his hand and said quietly, "When I first read your report, I wanted to see those scars myself. The ones they said came from saving others years ago, and the new ones you earned this week." Daniel's heart skipped a beat. The scars. He hadn't expected that anyone, let alone the admiral, would know about them. "They're nothing, sir," he said quietly. "Just old wounds." The admiral shook his head. "They're proof that you've lived for others. The kind of scars that make men salute." Daniel looked down, speechless. The room was completely still. Even Blake, standing near the doorway, felt his eyes sting. He remembered the first day he'd mocked Daniel for being too quiet, too gentle. Now he was watching an admiral salute him. The admiral turned to the others and said, "Let this man be an example to every soldier on this ship. Bravery doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers, and bleeds, and still keeps going." Before leaving, the admiral placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder. "Take care of those scars, son. They tell the story of a man who never gave up." When he left the room, the medics broke their silence. Blake came up and said, half smiling, "Well, Doc, I think it's safe to say the Admiral's impressed." Daniel let out a soft laugh, the first genuine laugh in weeks. "Guess I'll have to live up to it now." As the day went on, people on the ship talked about what they'd seen, how the Admiral himself had saluted a medic. The man they once laughed at had become a legend, not because of medals or speeches, but because of who he truly was. That night, as Daniel sat alone by the window in the quiet infirmary, he looked out at the dark sea and touched his ribs gently. The scars still hurt, but now they meant something different. They were not marks of pain, they were marks of purpose. He whispered to himself, "Maybe this is what being strong really means." And for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to feel proud. Not for the glory, not for the salute, but for doing what was right, even when no one believed he could. Days passed after the Admiral's visit, but the memory of that salute stayed with everyone on the ship. It became a story that sailors whispered about in the mess hall, a story that spread through the fleet. The Admiral saluted a combat medic. No one could forget it. But for Daniel Ruiz, life slowly returned to normal. He didn't want fame or attention. He just wanted to do his work quietly, patching wounds, checking patients, training the younger medics. Still, something had changed inside him. The weight he had carried for years, the pain of being laughed at, the guilt of old battles, had finally begun to lift. Every time he passed through the corridors, soldiers and officers greeted him with respect. Some saluted him, others simply nodded, but all of them looked at him differently now. The man they once ignored had become a symbol of quiet strength. One afternoon, Daniel stood on the deck, looking out over the open sea. The sunlight sparkled across the waves, and a soft wind brushed against his face. He placed a hand over his ribs, feeling the faint outline of his scars beneath the uniform. For the first time, he didn't feel ashamed of them. He didn't see them as reminders of pain anymore. They were proof that he had survived, that he had done something meaningful. As he stood there, Blake joined him. The two men had become close friends after everything that happened. Blake leaned on the railing beside him and said, "You know, Doc, you've changed a lot of people here. Everyone's got more respect for medics now. You showed them what real courage looks like." Daniel smiled. "It wasn't just me. We all made it back." "Yeah," Blake said softly, "but only because of you." They stood there in silence for a while, listening to the sound of the waves. Then Blake added, "The Admiral sent a message this morning. You're being recommended for the Medal of Valor." Daniel turned his head, surprised. "What? That's not necessary." Blake chuckled. "You can say that all you want, but it's happening. The higher-ups want to recognize what you did." Daniel looked back at the horizon. "If they give me a medal, I'll accept it for the team, not just for me." Blake nodded, smiling. "That's exactly what I thought you'd say." That evening, the captain called everyone to the main deck. The entire crew gathered information, the sky glowing orange as the sun began to set. Daniel stood quietly among them, still unsure why he had been called there. When the captain stepped forward, holding a small box in his hands, Daniel's heart began to beat faster. "Sergeant Daniel Ruiz," the captain began, his voice loud and clear, "for extraordinary bravery under fire, for saving the lives of your fellow soldiers, and for demonstrating the true spirit of service, the fleet honors you today." Daniel froze as the captain opened the box and revealed a shining medal. The crew clapped softly, their eyes on him. Blake nudged him gently from behind. "Go on, document." Daniel stepped forward slowly. The captain pinned the medal to his uniform, then saluted him. Daniel hesitated for a moment before returning the salute, his chest tight with emotion. "I'm not good with speeches," he said quietly, turning toward the crew. "I just did what any medic would do. I'm grateful I could help, and I'm even more grateful that everyone made it home." For a few seconds, there was silence. Then the crew erupted into cheers. It wasn't loud or wild, it was proud, pure. Every face around him was filled with respect and gratitude. Daniel smiled softly. He didn't crave applause, but in that moment, surrounded by the people he had saved and those who had once mocked him, he felt something deeper than pride, peace. After the ceremony, as the crowd slowly dispersed, Blake walked up to him again. "You did it, document. From being the guy everyone joked about to the man the Admiral saluted. That's one hell of a story." Daniel laughed quietly. "It's not my story, Blake. It's ours." Later that night, he returned to the infirmary. The room was quiet, filled with the soft beeping of machines and the smell of antiseptic. He sat on one of the empty beds and looked around, the place where he had spent so much time healing others and himself. He picked up his medical bag, the same one he carried into battle, and ran his fingers over its worn leather. It was old, scratched, and blood-stained, but it had saved lives. Just like him, it had been through fire and survived. As he set the bag down, he caught his reflection in the small mirror on the wall. For years, he had seen a man haunted by loss and failure. But now he saw someone else. A man who had faced fear and refused to give up. He smiled faintly and whispered to himself, "You did okay, Ruiz." Outside, the ship moved gently through the waves. The stars shone above, bright and endless. Somewhere in the distance, another ship's lights blinked across the sea, and Daniel thought about all the people out there. Soldiers, medics, sailors, each carrying their own scars, each fighting their own battles. He hoped his story would remind them that strength isn't about shouting the loudest or fighting the hardest. It's about standing firm when it matters most. It's about having the courage to care. The next morning, Daniel was back at work. No special privileges, no extra rest. Just the same quiet man doing what he loved. When a young medic asked him how he stayed so calm under pressure, Daniel smiled and said, "Because when someone's life is in your hands, there's no room for fear. There's only room for hope." And that was the truth of who he was. Months later, when Daniel finally went home for leave, He carried the medal in his pocket and the scars on his body. When he met his mother, she noticed the way he walked, straighter, prouder, and she asked, "Did something change out there?" Daniel smiled and simply said, "Yeah, Mom." They finally saw the scars. He didn't need to explain more. The scars told the story of pain, of courage, and of a man who earned the respect of an admiral by never giving up on others, even when no one believed in him. As the night fell and the stars lit the sky, Daniel looked up and whispered a small prayer of gratitude. Not for the medal, not for the salute, but for the chance to make a difference. Because sometimes, the quietest hearts leave the loudest echoes.